All right, good morning. It's time to get started for the Bible class this morning. So we've been looking at different cities and kind of looking at biblical stories that all took place in that one particular location. And I'm actually kind of excited about today's lesson because this was the one that made me think of doing that. Because I think Bethel has probably one of the most intriguing storylines that happen at its location. And so many big events in Scripture took place near and around Bethel. This is just a sampling of, we can't even go through all of them this morning. It'd be, I would say probably, topped only maybe by Jerusalem. This is one of those locations that has a tremendous amount of history to it, the city of Bethel. So this was what it looked like. There was a book called Holy Land back in the, and I forget the author's name, and I meant to put it up there, and then, so I'm trying not to plagiarize it. I forgot the name of the author to put it up there when I went back there. I found this, you can, if you just Google Bethel, that's the only photo that I could find that popped up. It was taken back in 1894. There's just a few ruins in that area, so Bethel isn't really there necessarily, obviously, but it is a very hugely historically important city from the Old Testament. If you turn to Genesis chapter 13, we have a passage there that in Genesis chapter 13, very familiar passage on this one. Abram and Lot are there. So Abram went, this is verse 1, Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. And quarreling arose between Abram's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and the Perizzites were also living in the land at that time. So Abram said to Lot, let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we're close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left. So he's basically like, well, whatever. Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan, set out toward the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. And then we could read on, and we'll, shortly after that, we'd hear everything that goes on with Sodom and Gomorrah, but that's not the focus for this morning. So one of the things, big events that takes place at Bethel is the separation between Abram and Lot. But also, I don't know if you picked up on a couple of smaller little things in the reading of that. One of them is the first altar that Abraham built to God was built at Bethel. And so his first altar was there, at least very close to Bethel, between Bethel and Ai. So that was that location where really Father Abraham started his process of worshiping God, in so many ways was rooted in that location around Bethel. It's where he called on the name of the Lord, was at Bethel. So again, these are some really important key foundational things that were taking place in this location. They separate their flocks and their herds from each other there. And so, what Abram was left with was Canaan. But Canaan is obviously extremely important because it becomes the promised land. And so that area, you think about everything about Canaan and all that we know about how that becomes such an important location. Essentially, it got into the hands of the Israelites through a little easy, you take whichever one you want event that happened at Bethel. And as that was separated away, then we have clearly the separation between Lot and all of the trouble he had by the side he chose by going over to the cities, or at least closer to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. And then you have, obviously, Abram, who flourishes in the land of Canaan. So, however, at this time, the reason why it doesn't say he was in the city of Bethel or anything like that is because, first of all, it probably wasn't a city there yet. It's in an area that later gets known for having Bethel and Ai. So right now we're not even talking about a city yet, and even if we were, Bethel's not its name. So it wasn't called Bethel. It's known as Bethel, but that is not the original name. Does anyone happen off the top of their head know what the original name was? Good, we'll learn something. All right, if nobody knows that one. So we'll learn what the original city was. Turn over to Genesis chapter 28. And the first couple verses we're going to read here, starting in verse 10, I've asked Josh if he will read this one for us. So Josh is going to read the first couple verses of 28, verses 10 and 11 for us.
Jacob went with Sheba and set out for her. When he reached as it was me, he stopped in the night because he says, take it on slowly. There, he put under his head and laid down to sleep.
All right, Josh, thank you. So we see right away that he reached a certain place. All right, well, we're going to find out that certain place just so happens to be that it's going to be located right in the same spot at Bethel. So Jacob puts the stones under his head. In this, we read on in verse 12, he had a dream in which he saw a stairway resting on the earth with its top reaching to heaven, and the angels of God were ascending and descending on it. There above it stood the Lord, and he said, I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham, the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. The peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until what I have promised you. And so then when he wakes up from this, in verse 16, when Jacob awoke from his sleep, he thought, surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it. He was afraid and said, how awesome is this place? This is none other than the house of God. This is the gate of heaven. Early the next morning, he took the stone he had placed under his head and set it up as a pillar and poured oil on top of it. He called the place Bethel, though the city used to be called Luz. Or Luz, I don't really know that. I'm not really totally familiar with all the Canaanite dialects. But I imagine, let's say Luz, otherwise it makes the people who live there losers, right? So we go with Luz on that one. So if it used to be called Luz, and then he changes the name to basically House of God. When Jacob experiences that, we think about that, Jacob's ladder, that phrase that's, made its way all the way even into modern culture still. It's one of those, there's a few biblical stories that people don't even realize they're referencing a biblical story. If, the thought of Jacob's ladder or the writings on the wall, all that kind of stuff, all these phrases that people throw out, they don't realize how much impact God's word has had on culture just in general as well. But in this one, we see a few things coming out of this. We learned that Bethel's original name was Luz. When he reached a certain place, I think that's kind of an interesting thing there, because it does make you wonder if God caused him or wanted him to stop there because it already had importance. And then he lays his head down there, and what Jacob sees is essentially this is, the wording of it is so centralized. You're going to spread out from the east and the west, to the north and the south. It's as though this was the hub of what God was going to have for his land there. And so it seems to have a lot of importance in this one. The ladder to heaven, is the dream there where it seems as though there's some sort of connection that God has to his people is in that centralized location. And we do see that over time. God, until Christ comes, where the door is open a little bit wider in the sense of how he can reach his people, he always worked through locations. For a while, he worked through Shiloh, as we saw. He worked through Jerusalem. And it seems like originally that was all taking place through Bethel. Surely the Lord is in this place. How awesome is this place? I mean, that's the way Bethel is described initially. Like a lot of these, they don't seem to end well. It's like, oh, come on, Israelites, you're ruining a good thing again this week. But it does look like that. That's probably, spoiler alert, it's not really a spoiler when every single Old Testament city seems to have its downfall later in the years of the Israelites. Turn over a few more passages, or a few more chapters to a passage in Genesis chapter 35. On this one, this is the story of how Bethel's name changed from Luz a little bit on this one. So God said to Jacob, go up to Bethel and settle there. I should say that's not really, I may have kind of worded that weirdly. It's not so much how Bethel's name was changed from Luz, it's how the people locally, because Jacob's been calling it Bethel. The locals still called it Luz. Like, just because he has a dream out there and he's like, I'm going to call this place Bethel. If somebody had a dream somewhere on the edge of Topeka and they're like, I'm going to change the name to whatever, it'd take us a while before we'd all latch onto it, right? We're going to still call it Topeka for a while because it's what we know, it's what our address says. There's a lot of legal loops to jump through. I don't know what all was involved in that. But the city of Luz, they're just going to keep calling it what they've always called it. Jacob refers to it. God refers to it at Bethel. But officially, it's still Luz, okay, at this point. That's what I meant by that, just so it makes sense. So he says, go up to Bethel and settle there and build an altar there to God, who appeared to you when you were fleeing from your brother Esau. So Jacob said to his household and to all who are with him, get rid of the foreign gods you have with you and purify yourselves and change your clothes. Then come, let us go to Bethel, where I will build an altar to God, who answered me in the day of my distress, and who has been with me wherever I have gone. So they gave Jacob all the foreign gods they had and the rings in their ears, and Jacob buried them under the oak at Shechem. Then they set out, and the terror of God fell on the towns all around them, so that no one pursued them. Again, you can see God at work there with the terror of God falling on them. There's no reason why they shouldn't have been pursued other than God's assistance there. God was with them all along. Oddly enough, anything jump out at you that's weird about Jacob's household at that point in time?
Still worshiping idols.
Yeah, the idol worship was still going on within his family. And I think that's such a strange thing that, here you've already had Jacob, who, we think of this, Abram left everything, becomes Abraham. And then you've got Isaac and everything that goes on between Isaac and Jacob and Esau, and Jacob keeps, now turning toward God. He has this dream in which God says, I'm going to make you into a nation, into a people, and I'll give you all this land. You're going to be gone. I'll bring you back. I mean, all these promises that were given there at Bethel. And yet still, as he's wandering around for a while before he comes back to Bethel, his whole household is still idol worshiping. Finally, he gets rid of this and cleans house. And he cleans that up, and he's able to bury that under the oak at Shechem. And then they go in there. Jacob and all the people with him came to Luz, that is Bethel, in the land of Canaan. There he built an altar, and he called the place El Bethel, because it was there that God revealed himself to him when he was fleeing from his brother. Now Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died and was buried under the oak outside of Bethel, so it was named Allon-Beketh. After Jacob returned from Paddan Aram, God appeared to him again and blessed him. God said, your name is Jacob. You will no longer be called Jacob. Your name will be Israel. So he named him Israel. Where did that happen? Bethel. It's amazing how many big things. I mean, that's a big deal when Jacob's name becomes Israel, because Israel is now going to be the tribes of Jacob, or the tribes of Israel. This is where they become a people of he's the first in the bloodline of the Israelites. And the name change takes place in this location as well. And God said to him, I am God Almighty. Be fruitful and increase in number. A nation and a community of nations will come from you and be your descendants. The land I gave to Abraham and Isaac I also give to you, and I will give this land to your descendants after you. Then God went up from him at the place where he had talked to him. Jacob set up a stone pillar at the place where God had talked with him, and he poured out a drink offering on it, and he also poured oil on it. Jacob called the place where God had talked with him Bethel. That's a little bit more of the official name change is taking this. So he was told by God, go back there. So there's got to be a reason God wants that location. There's something about the location of Bethel that God wants to utilize that particular location where he wanted the altar built. Maybe so that there is a little bit of historical kind of continuity. The fact that Abraham went and worshiped at Bethel. And now Jacob goes back, worships at Bethel. And we're starting to see that having a centralized location is going to be something that becomes a theme throughout the Old Testament of where they meet together to worship. And so we see that kind of taking place. Jacob rids his household of all the foreign gods, and God speaks to Jacob there. And that's a big deal on how it changes Jacob. And of course, it changes him so much that his name's changed to Israel. And so now we see all of these changes taking place at this particular location. Some big things, though, are going to continue to happen in this city as well. After he promised them a land and a people, the other people are still there. And so that becomes a little bit of an issue down the road a bit. So turn over to Judges chapter 1, and we'll see a little bit of the rest of the story start to play itself out. Judges chapter 1, starting in verse 22. Now the tribes of Joseph, all right, so we're a couple generations down the road here. So now you've had, obviously, just so we're all on the same page here, you've got Israel, one of his children, Joseph, the tribes of Joseph. Why were those plural? You remember that? There's always a tribe of Judah, a tribe of of Gideon, all this. Why was there two? And they were the ones that became the tribes. Because remember, there's 12 tribes. Which is the one that didn't have, like, when they divided the land up, which one didn't get the land? Levi. So they split Joseph's land into the two sons, and you have the half tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. So that's where you get those two difference. So that's the tribes of Joseph, just so we're all on the same page there. All right, so the tribes of Joseph attacked Bethel, and the Lord was with them. When they sent men to spy out Bethel, formerly called Luz, the spies saw a man, and I think we're going to see here, the locals are still calling it Luz, because you'll see this in just a second when it plays itself out. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, "Show us how to get into the city, and we'll see that you're treated well." You don't normally let strangers into your city. That was not a common practice back then. My guess is that these spies probably, I think it's not written there, but I think we can kind of infer from the fact that they promised to treat you well. I don't think this was like some wonderful to meet you. We'd like to enter your city and we're going to treat you well. Oh, sure, let me show you the way. I think it was probably a little bit more roughed up kind of an approach. Like, you're going to show us into the city. You'll be treated well, and the other option is we'll kill you right here probably. They were coming to kill the inhabitants of the city, but we'll protect you if you show us in. And I think what looks to have happened is he kind of cut a deal with the spies. Now, I could be wrong. It is not written there. That's an inference, but that's the best interpretation I can take out of that, is that when they were going to take over the city of Bethel, the tribes show up to attack it. The spies, who are clearly out ahead of the tribes that are ready to attack the city, needed a way in. All right, so he showed them, and they put the city to the sword, but spared the man and his whole family. Then he went to the land of the Hittites, where he built a city and called it Luz, which is its name to this day, at least of the time of the writing. So when his family was all killed, it's like, fine, we'll go make another Luz. So they go to the land of the Hittites, and they start up another one. So what could have been confusing to people is the fact that there was a city of Luz in the time of this writing. It's like, no, Luz isn't Luz. Luz is Old Bethel. So like trying to like get that storyline that took place there. So kind of a strange little event that happened in this place. So I guess I could have just put it right up there. I forgot I put that passage up on there, so if you were reading along. So again, that was, he went to the land of the Hittites in verse 24, where he built a city and called it Luz, which is its name to this day. So Luz is now finally in a different location, and Bethel is in the hands of the tribes of Joseph. And so that's how they get control of that city, and it has now been ridded of the Canaanites. They moved off, and now it's with the Hittites. All right, so last week we talked about a story that was kind of an interesting one when we were talking about Shiloh. And this is where the reason why we did Shiloh last week and Bethel this week is because this is where the storylines cross just a little bit. They're not very far from each other, right? We even said that Shiloh was just off the Bethel-Shechem highway, if you remember that one from last time. It was on so it's not far from each other. So it's not unusual that storylines would crisscross just a little bit. But a really interesting one that takes place in Judges 20 through 22 was a storyline where kind of some really, some terrible things the Benjamites were doing. What we didn't talk about the whole backstory last time of why the Benjamites were in so much trouble with God and with the other 11 tribes, were essentially what they tried to do and what they set out to do was there was a visitor that comes in and is staying in the city there, and they basically are banging on the door so that he could be brought out so they can have sex with him. That was the whole thing that set it up. And they said, no, that's horrible. I can't believe you guys are wanting to do this. Instead, I'm going to give you my daughter and his concubine. And that's when they raped her so terribly she died. and then he cuts her up into pieces and sends them to all the tribes. This terrible story. It's not a pleasant story. I mean, no matter how you look around it. But it was sent out there basically to incite the Israelites to say, this is what the Benjamites did. And so they sent 12 pieces out to the 12 tribes to basically say, this is horrible. And they said, we're never giving our wives to the Benjamites. They're never getting our daughters, not our wives. They're never getting our daughters to be their wives. We're never going to give wives to the Benjamites. Well, when they did all of that, and so when we look at this in Judges chapter, we're up to like 21 at that point, they made this promise. What was the city that, if you remember from last week, what city did they realize was an option for them of one group that didn't assemble with all the rest, that they were like, wait a minute, there's still one group of guys, because they started having second thoughts. I should point out, where does Bethel come into play here? All right, so on this one, the loophole of forbidding to give wives to the Benjamites was found when the virgin daughters of the town of Jabesh Gilead, is the name of the town, they realized that nobody came from Jabesh Gilead and made that promise, that oath that they swore, that vow, we'll never give our wives. Nobody was there from Jabesh Gilead, so technically they didn't make a promise to that. Well, when they were brought to Shiloh, everything else that happened there, the place where they cry out to God about what should we do, should we really attack our own brothers in the Benjamite tribe, and God said, yes, and I'll be with you. That was all being done at Bethel. They kept assembling at Bethel and deciding to annihilate one of their own tribes over this horrific act that they performed. And at the end, when they were, yes, they bring, because Shiloh, not far from Bethel, is where the worship was set up, and which is probably proximity to Bethel was probably pretty critical there of why Shiloh was chosen. But the idea, though, was when they came back and they're like, wait a minute, we're gonna lose one of our whole tribes, by doing this. And they call out to God and they find this loophole. Well, that conversation they were having with each other, that was all happening at Bethel. Now, they bring them, the virgin daughters, after they wipe out Jabesh Gilead, all but the virgin daughters, the 400 of them, they're brought up to Shiloh. But all of the people had gathered at Bethel. And so that was kind of where all that was taking place. And so kind of an interesting, dark but interesting story that takes place that incorporates both of these. So they cried out to God to strike down the Benjamites, and it's also where they cry out to God to save them, just a little bit later in that same passage. So the conversations with God about whether or not the Benjamite tribe is going to continue on existing, all of that conversation was going on at Bethel. There's a few more passages, that big events that take place there. In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 23, it says, from there Elisha went up to Bethel. As he was walking along the road, some boys came out from the town and jeered at him. Get out of here, Baldy, they said. Get out of here, Baldy. You guys remember that story, right? When Elisha was treated. Do you remember what happens to those boys that come out of there? Probably rowdy teenagers is what it sounds like. And bears come and what? Yeah, they come out there and they just shred those boys to pieces. So never make fun of somebody's hair loss is the takeaway. No, it's not really the takeaway message, but maybe it is. You got to be careful about that one when you mock somebody that way. But when they were out there, when Elisha's out there doing good work and they focused on something negative about him and mocking him for it, he turns the table on them and the bears come and just take them apart. Well, that was Bethel when that happened. 1 Samuel 10, verses 3 and 4, then you will go from here until you reach the great tree of Tabor. The men got up to worship God at Bethel, and we will meet you there. One will be carrying 3 young goats, another 3 loaves of bread, another a skin of wine. They will greet you and offer you 2 loaves of bread, which you will accept from them. So what's going on here? So before Saul becomes king, he was really unsure. Are you sure it's going to be me? I'm supposed to be king of the Israelites. Is it really me? And, he kind of fled. If you remember, they had to go hunt him down and find him, hiding in these, all these grain bags and everything. It's like, oh yeah, it's supposed to be you. Well, he goes up to meet Samuel up at the high place, not too far from Bethel. And he tells him, okay, here's going to be one of the signs for you. When you go, 3 men are going to be coming down from Bethel. They're going to meet you, and they're going to happen to have all these gifts for you. And then it was basically just proof after proof after proof that, yes, Saul, you are supposed to be king. Here's your proof. So Bethel comes into play on that big, momentous change in the Israelites from going from a period of judges to the period of kings. And one of the signs that really proved without a shadow of doubt to Saul at least that he was supposed to be that king was an event in which they left and came down from Bethel. A couple other ones in 2 Kings 23. Josiah smashed the sacred stones and cut down the Asherah poles and covered the sites with human bones. That took place at Bethel. Even the altar at Bethel, the high place made by Jeroboam, son of Nebat, who had caused Israel to sin. Even that altar and high place he demolished. He burned the high place and burned it to powder and burned the Asherah pole also. Had I gone back and read 1 Kings 13, but for the sake of time, we don't have time to do that. But had I read that, there'd be a whole lot of story about everything terrible that Jeroboam did and how much he centered it on Bethel. So good things happened at Bethel, where they were all centralized into their worship of God, but Jeroboam took them down, essentially, which leads to all of their captivity and everything, by centralizing terrible events at Bethel and the worship of Asherah and other worship of the high places that went on. And so Josiah, remember, good King Josiah comes in and he just tries to clean everything back up, including that big false worshiping spot now of Bethel. And he kind of cleans that up as well. And then it has a downfall during this time. And so in Hosea 10:15, it says, so it will happen to you, Bethel, because your wickedness is great. When that day dawns, the king of Israel will be completely destroyed. And so Bethel now, in the later passages, just doesn't have that affectionate tone anymore. Things have changed there, and it all is Jeroboam's fault. I mean, not all, and it's Jeroboam's kick-started this process, but he really rotted Bethel. What he did at Bethel was so egregious that it ruined the city. The place where God had appeared to Abraham, where he had appeared to Jacob and changed his name to Israel, where he had divided the land between Abraham and Lot, where all of these wonderful, big, important events had taken place. Jeroboam just comes in and just taints it completely on this. Jeremiah refers back. Now, he's actually not even talking about Bethel at the time. He's going to reference Bethel. He's talking about other ruins that are coming. And he says, but the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will send men who pour from pitchers. And they will pour her out. They will empty her pitchers and smash her jars. Then Moab will be ashamed of Chemosh, as Israel was ashamed when they trusted in Bethel. So Bethel becomes a reference, basically, to things gone bad. And so it's kind of sad when you see these wonderful locations of great events, and rather than holding them up in high esteem, you see the Israelites who stopped holding God up in high esteem take the same places and taint them the same way they tainted their whole position toward how they treated God on that. Anybody have any thoughts? That was the last of the passages on there. Some interesting ones. I know some of you kind of reached out to me and gave me a few ideas of places, and I've looked through all the ones that you've said. I will make no promises because some of the ones you guys suggested had very little, as in a 2-verse passage on it. I don't know that I could do 30 minutes on a 2-verse passage on that one, but I might do like a hodgepodge one where we do a whole bunch of little locations or things like that. So we'll find some other cities to kind of look through, but kind of an interesting one, I think. Bethel is intriguing to me because of how important it was, and yet again we see how easy it is to take something of God's importance, and if humans don't respond to God correctly, how we can just ruin it. And that certainly was the case there at Bethel. All right, I believe that we're probably about done with class time, so we'll wrap up there and dismiss for class. And again, if you are leaving for the morning, if you were at the first service, don't forget next Sunday is Spring Forward. I didn't mention that in the first service, but make sure you get those clocks correctly. Otherwise, you'll be at first service, whether you intended to or not, just really, really early. But again, next we do spring our clocks forward before next Sunday.